Tuning in with KrASIA, bringing human stories to life. Hey everyone, my name is Emily, the KrASIA community lead for our Tuning In series on chats with prominent key leaders in their industry. Today we have Elisa Chiu, who is an entrepreneur and investor. She is the founder of Anchor Venture Partners, an early stage investment platform in Taiwan that combines her passion for startups and her expertise in capital markets. She sailed from Wall Street with a decade of experience at top-tier investment banks and hedge funds, overseeing $1 billion US in assets in Pan-Pacific Asia. She was also awarded 40 Under 40 as a woman in tech in 2018 and recognized as one of the 30 women powered by new Taipei City Government in 2019. I'm very excited to have Elisa Chiu here today with me. Hi, Elisa. Thank you so much for being here.
Hello, hey Emily, and hello everyone. Great to be here.
Yeah, so I think, it's quite exciting because, you're in Taiwan right now. You're definitely an industry expert and very highly entrepreneurial. So you know the landscape very well. And I think Taiwan, especially in these times, you've seen a lot of change within the industry landscape. So today's topic will be on a spotlight for Taiwan's industry. Can you quickly summarize what the landscape of Taiwan's innovation and startup ecosystem currently looks like?
Sure, definitely. Well, first of all, again, super awesome to be here and saying hello from Taipei. We're pretty lucky here, relatively okay among this crazy COVID situation. So just quickly, a quick introduction about the innovation ecosystem here in Taiwan. Usually I try to dissect the ecosystem from usually from talent, capital, government involvements, and also market perspectives. I will first give a very quick overview. So just a few key points for people to remember. First, the Taiwan startup ecosystem is actually hugely involved with the governments. So there are a lot of different government initiatives from the central governments, including the Ministry of Science and Technology, Ministries of Economics Affairs, the National Development Councils, and so on and so forth. So a lot of government initiatives from the central governments. In addition to that, we also see a lot of initiatives from the local governments as well. So say, for example, Taipei City, New Taipei City, Taoyuan, Hsinchu, and so on and so forth. So basically, overall in Taiwan, you will come across a lot of government-driven initiatives and programs for startup founders and even on the investment side. So that's all like the first things that a lot of foreign founders will probably notice when they come into this ecosystem. And another area to keep in mind, I think it's useful to understand also in terms of kind of like on the cross-border basis, which markets that Taiwan historically has been close with. I think, historically, Taiwan has a pretty strong tie with the US, particularly with the Silicon Valley. So now even a lot of big tech companies in Silicon Valley, you can actually still see a lot of Taiwanese Americans as their leaders. Like say, for example, NVIDIA, run by a Taiwanese American, even AMD, Jensen, even AMD, like Amy, also basically Taiwanese American. So in addition to Silicon Valley, we also traditionally, because of the similar language and culture, also very close with China. So a lot of businesses, Foxconn, as well as a lot of other players from the supply chain here, they all have their presence in China as well. However, I would say increasingly in recent years, we're seeing more and more interest into Southeast Asia as well. So this is definitely very interesting to increase more of the connections and conversations around Taiwan and Southeast Asia. And a lot of people ask me, why they should come to Taiwan as a startup founders or investors. I think, here, specifically around talent, we have a lot of talents good at software and hardware integration. So in addition to a lot of just kind of like general engineers, because of decades of industry expertise around semiconductors, panels, and so on and so forth, we have a lot of talents that are specifically strong that can do both. software and hardware. And I think increasingly for frontier technology, that's very, very important. In addition to that, cost of living, I think compared with a lot of places, and infrastructure when it comes to internet and mobile phones or like penetration, great place for people to be. So, you know, like from manufacturing to even software companies looking for a place as their pilot markets here in Taiwan, those are all some elements to consider if you want to look for your next sort of like innovation ecosystem to get into. So those are just like some very quick and dirty sort of like overview about our innovation ecosystem.
Yeah, that's awesome. I think, sorry, one other thing to add too, I think is like IP, intellectual property, right? Like,
Yeah,
in
definitely.
Taiwan, it's also, they have a very strong like process where, you know, they know if they work with companies in Taiwan, their IP is like protected. So
Yes.
that's great. Okay, yeah, so, you know, kind of going back to the industry spotlight topic that we're talking about, you know, I'm curious to know more about the supply chain and traditional sectors that you've mentioned. Can you let us know, I guess, like, you know, what are like the strong industries that you're seeing right now, and then kind of break it down for us? Yeah.
Sure. Yeah. I think among many things, supply chain definitely is a key word for Taiwan. And
Mhm.
I'll break it down into two segments. One is more around ICT supply chain. So information and communication technology, like semiconductor panels or iPhone and notebook related, more consumer electronics side of thing. And another side is more around non-ICT supply chain. So like traditional industries, including like plastic, metals, cement, and so on and so forth. So let's first look at the ICT supply chain. Some people will probably argue, like now when we think of the world factory, people naturally will associate China. However, decades and decades and decades ago, basically, some people probably will argue that Taiwanese people sort of helped build Shenzhen. Because if you look at the biggest contract manufacturers in the world, Foxconn, essentially, you know, it's a Taiwanese company, but obviously with a huge presence in China. So basically with that, and also whole supply chain for Apple, from basically Wistron, a lot of like big players, Catcher, and so on and so forth. Those are a huge elements when it comes to the Taiwanese economy. In fact, in Taiwan, we have about 800 listed companies,
Oh, wow.
all in the ICT space, contributing a lot to our economy and also a lot of cross-border sort of like economics activities. In addition to previously from PC, from laptop to iPhone, basically whole mobile phone. Now, increasingly, we also have a lot of players getting into the electric vehicle space. So even Foxconn, say, for example, Quanta and Tempo, a lot of these big players, they're all transforming from basically laptop, mobile phone now into, I guess, a lot of people will say the electric vehicles or autonomous driving vehicles in the future, they're kind of like a giant mobile phone, like a personal computer that basically come with us. So they're also transforming along with the industry as well. And in addition to that, I think one very strong sort of like sector around the ICT supply chain in Taiwan is around semiconductor. So increasingly, I guess recently, because of the US-China trade war especially, people know more and more about TSMC. Previously, sometimes when I mentioned TSMC, even though they are a huge company when it comes to market cap, you know, like one of the biggest in the world, a lot of people don't really know about their names. So TSMC stands for Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, and they are the biggest contract semiconductor foundry in the world with over 50% market share.
Wow.
And the second one is Samsung. Samsung is less than 20%. So basically they're like way ahead of their second player in that industry. And even today, the news came out that Japan was also trying to basically get them to potentially go to Japan to build a semiconductor plant, because it's going to be, semiconductor is going to be a very important and crucial element when it comes to powering all the frontier technology from 5G, autonomous driving, and so on and so forth. Another side of the sort of like supply chain is the non-ICT supply chains. And a lot of people in the world don't realize that Taiwan is also really strong when it comes to this. So like from plastic, petrochemical, textile, we actually manufacture and supply to a lot of world biggest brands like Nike, Adidas, you know, like Lululemons and so on and so forth. There are a lot of big sort of like players in Taiwan that power all of these big brands from around the world. Even when it comes to like cement, metals, say for example, screws, we used to have the biggest market shares, now still market values when it comes to screws manufacturing. Like you wouldn't think of Taiwan.
Random. Yeah.
Exactly. But then, yeah, the reason that I mentioned all of these players, either from the ICT sector or non-ICT sectors, is that there are a few things that they have in common.
Okay.
One, a lot of these companies are really rich with their cash balance. So, when it comes to having enough dry powder to invest into innovation, like these are the candidates that actually have the power if they want to do so. Another thing is that a lot of these companies, they're basically at this very crucial junction of transforming themselves, because they also understand, if they are in the plastic space, what do they need to do to stay relevant? Like a lot of these companies are still generating billions and billions of revenue every year, but then what do they do to stay relevant? And increasingly, they are turning into startups to look for partners and solutions. So an amazing place to look for potential partners and investors, among them. The third point to remember is that increasingly there's more and more of a focus around supply chain and sustainability, because the whole world, we're looking for greener solutions and ways of doing things so that we can basically have a more sustainable sort of like environments. And guess where you need to go in order to basically fix that issues, given that Taiwan is so crucial when it comes to this whole supply chain, global supply chain segments. Then, I think this is also a place where a lot of those technologies and solutions can be applied. So I think all of those are a few things to remember when it comes to Taiwan as a special destination for startup funders and also investors.
Yeah, no, I think that's great. Thank you for sharing that. And I do think that it is interesting to see enterprises like, maybe companies who have been around for so long, they are starting to pivot and become like startups again, right? Because now it's really about how do they stay relevant and how do they continue grabbing like the market share that they have been for the past, but things have changed. So one thing that, I wanted to bring up too was something I read in Taipei Times, which was an article featuring, more than 450 companies were pledging to invest $1 trillion like NT dollars to, it's under like a government incentive program and attracting Taiwanese manufacturers to return home. So yeah, I'm curious to know kind of, like, has the supply chain industry been broken or disrupted? And, how do you see Taiwan evolving in this? Yeah.
Totally. So this whole kind of like coming back home initiative has started since I think, like 2019. And so far it has been working pretty well. So as you mentioned, we do see a waves of Taiwanese companies, especially moving back from China back to Taiwan. And I think this whole initiative started among the US-China trade war, and COVID-19 definitely accelerated this whole movement. And essentially, especially around the data center sort of like industry. So especially for these segments around supply chain where higher premiums, higher margins, basically those are among the first that move back. And we're seeing a lot of big players like Quanta, like there's actually maps that you can find on the internet to actually map out from which part of China do they move back to which part of Taiwan, which was very fascinating to see. I would say there are a few things to also remember, or at least from my observations around this. One, I think the government also understood that, like asking them to come back home and seeing them coming back is great, but at the same time, which kind of companies or which kind of industries to attract back? And also when they move back, are there ways to simultaneously also upgrade like the system and basically inject, say, for example, AI solutions or Industry 4.0 solutions so that, like in Taiwan, we can keep industries and also factories that are more competitive with higher margin. That's also a really crucial thing to remember. So that's why, in addition to basically just this pure movement in terms of getting the factories to come back to Taiwan and basically now expanding when it comes to factory lands and so on and so forth. There's also a huge push when it comes to working more with startups to basically kind of like, hey, don't just build a new factories that are old, like 20, 30 years ago before this factories move over to China. But since you're building a new factories, hey, guess what? You can basically start designing and incorporating a lot of these new solutions. So I think that's very interesting to observe. And for me, I would look beyond just kind of like the total number when it comes to the capital that they sort of like bring back, and also kind of like push that further to really ensure that, hey, these are not just some low end sort of like manufacturing that move back. So that's sort of like the first thing. And the second thing to really, at least for me, that really got my attention is that because of the US-China trade war, because of COVID-19, I think if anything, the supply chain in Taiwan so far is actually one of the beneficiaries. Exports, say for example, so far this year, I think has actually increased. And a lot of manufacturing major players in Taiwan, for their Q1 and Q2 revenue and numbers, looks actually better than expected. And some of them, even better than last year. Obviously, I still hope the whole world will get better because, you know, like these days, not a single player can operate in isolation forever. So, you know, like we still want the whole world to recover and basically to get back to normal soon. But one thing to note is that because of all of this trade war and COVID situation, Taiwan is getting more and more visibility. What I just mentioned, say for example, TSMC, that's one quick example. But then in addition to that, the whole suite of players in Taiwan, MediaTek, UMC, and so on and so forth, they're all getting quite a lot of attention. So this is actually great opportunities for both industry players, startup founders, and also corporates in Taiwan to think about, hey, we now have this opportunity to offer what we have for the world. What do we do? And also for industry players from around the world to think about how to collaborate more with Taiwan. Because I think, you know, like one industry leaders that I respect a lot, the founder and president of DigiTimes, Coley Huang, he actually told me, he was like, hey, Taiwan is a harmless partner. So by harmless is because, you know, we're tiny. So essentially, we are just like a really, we're a good partner. Like, and this is in almost kind of like in our DNA and in our culture, because traditionally when you observe, we're very good at OEM and ODM, which means basically the big brands, they basically have the specs, and we're just really good at realizing the best products and services in the world. So I think at times like this, when very often technology becomes kind of like one of the bargaining chips in the global politics, Taiwan definitely, I think, you know, like relatively, we don't have as much agenda, and also because of our size, because of history, I think increasingly people realize that we are actually a good partner to have when it comes to both manufacturing and also other types of collaboration.
Yeah, thank you. That's great. I think that's incredibly insightful, especially for everyone or anyone, you know, companies, startups, and investors looking to, you know, look and work more closely with Taiwan. And, you know, going off on that, I think that's a really good segue into my next question as well, which is, you know, I know you started Anchor Taiwan Partners. Like, I guess, like, from your expertise, right? Like, what is your general approach or advice to those who, you know, want to make capital investments in this space and work closely with Taiwan? Yeah.
Sure. Yeah. So I started Anchor Taiwan in 2017, essentially focusing on more innovation programs and entrepreneurial residency. We believe that basically, you know, like Taiwan can really play a role when it comes to contributing to the best teams and startups when it comes to realizing their solutions to build a better sort of like world. So in the beginning, we are very cross-border focused, and we believe that the toughest issues in the world, we need people to come together to find that solution and to build that solution. And Anchor Venture Partners, our investment arm, started in last year, 2019. So basically, I came from a late stage investment background. So after running the program for 2 years, we started seeing some of these startups that we brought over started landing in Taiwan and working really well with our industries. So increasingly, I'm seeing these opportunities that we should really sort of like utilize. So from last year, we started this investment arm. One, because I do really hope to see more early stage funding in this space. Yeah, in Taiwan, there's no shortage of money. There's a lot of, as I mentioned,
Good to hear.
companies with a lot of cash, also a lot of actually very wealthy individuals. However, I do have to say that a lot of this capital, we're transitioning, but a lot of this capital are still relatively conservative. So basically, one huge reason for me to start Anchor Venture Partners is hopefully we can make early stage investing more transparent and also kind of like more available for especially global talents trying to get to Taiwan. So in addition to that, we're also hoping to be that conduit between the corporates and global sort of like startup solutions. So I would say for advice, that's actually kind of like depending on which side of the equation that you're coming in. I would say for international founders looking to coming into Taiwan for, let's say, like potentially your talent, capital, market, or partnership, I would say the first thing to think about is what's your Taiwan angle? So, like if you're coming to Taiwan looking for your investors, think about why these investors should invest in you. In addition to the typical elements that you should consider, your team, why this market, why you, why now, and all of the above, think about why specifically Taiwan.
Okay.
Why should, like what unique value proposition do you have for this particular sort of like Taiwanese investors? So I always tell people in our programs or not that you should definitely think first sort of like around that when you want to approach the Taiwanese investors. And another thing to sort of like also pay attention to is I noticed that in Taiwan, now there are actually a few directions that you can approach if you are looking for capital as an international startup founders coming to Taiwan. One, the good news is that more and more overseas Taiwanese, especially quite a few from Silicon Valley, I'm seeing more and more of them are coming back to Taiwan. And many of them brought back the Silicon Valley type of entrepreneurship, this mindsets, this investing styles, and so on and so forth. So increasingly, we're seeing more players when it comes to early stage investing in Taiwan. So this place is getting more and more fun because, like we used to feel kind of lonely, but now definitely look into some of those players basically kind of like coming back. And another area would be, as I mentioned just now, we have a lot of big tech companies and also traditional players. They might be really kind of like looking to work with startups. In fact, there was actually a report showing that in the last 4 or 5 years or so, when it comes to startup funding, over 50% actually came from CVC, so corporate venture capital. So that gives you an indication that you don't need to only focus on the traditional, more financial return-driven kind of investors or angels. You can actually also look into corporates because in Taiwan, they play a very important role. So the thing is, sometimes it's not so easy to find them because like a lot of time it's still not so transparent even for locals, not to mention for international funders it might be even a little bit more difficult. But one trick is that it's actually public information about, say for example, their cash balance. So we actually just did an internal review in terms of who are the companies with over 2 billion cash balance sitting on their balance sheet, say for example, these are probably people who either, like they themselves would want to start thinking about how to spend that money, or their shareholders probably will be pushing them and asking them, hey, like, are you gonna try to look for good investment opportunities, or, are you going to return some of that cash to us? So maybe kind of like map out the landscape to identify who are the corporates that have that dry powder to invest. That's also a good way to start identifying your targets. And another area is more from the traditional sort of like accelerators and VCs. Definitely do your homework. In Taiwan, the most established and well-known in terms of kind of like accelerator AppWorks, it's a great place to start. And basically do your homework to map out other players. Another area is actually more from the financial holding companies. So in Taiwan, they're also among the richest when it comes to cash balance, and a lot of them also have their venture arms with pretty diverse portfolio. They typically focus on later stage companies because of the structure and also because of the culture within the financial holding companies, but those are definitely also targets. If you are slightly more mature, usually kind of like A or beyond, then those can be good candidates to talk to when you look for funding in Taiwan.
Yeah, that's awesome. I definitely agree with you. I mean, I have seen, especially like, corporations or like banks or everyone kind of just has a, venture arm. And the strategy that you mentioned, right, which is like, looking for those companies who have dry powder, as you said, and seeing if they have a venture arm. So I think, yeah, that's very great and is very smart. Yeah, so I think my last question for you would just be generally any, I guess, like resources or things that entrepreneurs should tap into, considering Taiwan's industries, and just general last comments that you would want to give to our listeners. Yeah.
Sure. Yeah. I think, like it's given that the government is hugely involved in the startup ecosystem here in Taiwan, I would still say it's useful to at least know what your options are. So look into different initiatives under different ministries. So, the three that I mentioned from MOST, Ministry of Science and Technology, they have their TTA, Taiwan Tech Arena, and Ministry of Economics Affairs, they have their Startup Terrace, and NDC, the National Development Council, they have TSS, Taiwan Startup Stadium. They all have different programs, and like as I mentioned, city governments, they also have different initiatives that founders can take advantage as well when it comes to subsidies and kind of like self-lending programs and so on and so forth. So I think those are a great place to start. One thing that I will caution is try to avoid getting or becoming into a B2G kind of companies, because very often what I see is that some founders then, because there's just so many programs and different sort of like subsidies and so on and so forth. And then they just became kind of like professional grant writers and constantly kind of like getting into different programs and getting into different grants. And so I think it's important to get that right balance and to know your options, but also understand that sometimes the resources might come with string attached. Like sometimes it might mean you need to spend extra time when it comes to bureaucracy, or they might have different KPIs than yours and so on and so forth. So know your options and pick the best one that's suitable for you, but basically kind of take all of that into consideration. And I would say another thing very important, as soon as possible, get yourself here.
Yeah.
Because it's still the best way when you have the opportunity to have that face-to-face interaction with the local stakeholders. So get into monthly events here. Anchor, we also host monthly gatherings for newcomers and investors and entrepreneurs to basically kind of like exchange thoughts, find out what events are available out there and start meeting the local ecosystem builders. Those are also great ways to kick off your new chapters here in Taiwan. The good thing here is that because Taiwan is relatively small, even though we do have 23 million people, so it's a meaningful pilot market. But the startup ecosystem, compared with, let's say, China, Silicon Valley, or some other places, is relatively easy to navigate. So, like instead of being a small fish in a big pond, here, if you work hard, it's actually relatively easy to get noticed and to get seen. And it's relatively easy to get the right resources, to get, the visibility. So basically get yourself here and find the right people. And basically, here in Taiwan, most people are willing to help. So yeah, as long as you show that you're here, and also try to be thoughtful when it comes to, as a foreign entrepreneur, are there things that I can also contribute to the local ecosystem as well? I think that kind of mindset will also help you go very far.
Yeah, that's awesome. Thank you so much. And I'm pretty sure it's immensely helpful to all those entrepreneurs or, capital investors looking to expand in Taiwan. So thank you so much. We do have, two more episodes with Elisa Chiu, the second one on capital market, and then the third one on market and talent. So if you're around, please, stick around and listen to those two. But thanks again, Elisa. I really appreciate you being here. Yeah.
Thank you. Thanks. Bye.